Hi, welcome everybody. I'm not sure everyone has quite joined, so I'll just fumble a little bit before we know everyone's kind of joined the room. My name's Ian Hall, Head of Sales for the North. Sorry, I forgot to put North on the presentation there. And we have today James Cooper-Smith from our head office, who is the Portfolio Manager. I'll let you introduce yourself, Mr. Cooper-Smith.
Yeah, I'm James. I'm Portfolio Team Manager, deal with the more complex end of cases that we get, as well as large portfolio stuff. Been with Landbay almost 5 years now.
And I've worked with James many years with many different lenders, so we our paths have crossed many a time, and James really does know his stuff, and I think that is echoed across the whole of the underwriting team, that we've got the experience that counts when we're looking at the more complex deals, and looking for a reason to lend rather than not to lend. So today we are going to focus on HMOs. The last couple of weeks we've done a little bit of kind of portfolio in the background. We've done a little bit of limited company, and obviously one of the other kind of major criteria we offer at Landbay is the ability to offer HMOs and multi-units, and we don't just do the small HMOs and multi-units. We actually do up to 12 units on one block and 12 beds on an HMO, and we also have the ability as well to kind of breach those kind of limits as well for the right type of cases. So don't be afraid to ask James the question with regard to whether that fits, and even though it might not fit now, we'll normally know the lender it will fit, or we may can push that appetite a little bit further down the line as well. So today we're going to do a little bit of an education, and I won't spend too long on it, I don't think. But obviously the kind of criteria that sits behind our HMOs is fairly kind of straightforward. And I think some of the bits that we'll discuss today, you may well know, but I'm going to try and give some kind of a tangibility to it in regard to how it affects the landlords that are buying HMOs, and maybe even existing landlords that know about the kind of criteria that sits behind it, because there's lots of things that have changed over the last couple of years that really have affected the way the HMOs work in the market. Then we're going to look at the criteria for both our HMO and multi-unit. Then we're going to spend a little time looking at valuation types, because at Landbay we do two types of HMO. We offer investment valuations, and I want to provide some positivity around it, but also some caution around the types of valuations you can get in the HMO market, which is kind of very relevant when you're looking at the lender that you're looking for with regard to placement of the deal. So nice and simple. What is an HMO? Simple as, it's basically three tenants sharing and forming more than one household. You share the toilet, the bathroom, and kitchen facilities with the other tenants. That's as simple as it is. What you've got to make sure you don't get confused with is what is an HMO, which is this, and what is a licensed HMO. So we'll move on to that shortly, because many people just term an HMO as a 5-bedroom property, but actually an HMO is three tenants living in one property. So you've got to make sure you differentiate between an HMO and a licensed HMO property. So I'm just trying to get up with my screen as well, because I'm on two screens right now. I'll show everything together because it makes it a little bit easier. So licensing. This is where I've made the point earlier that an HMO is three or more people sharing. However, a licensed HMO, and this is mandatory, is an HMO with 5 beds or more, which means you would have to apply for an example license on the right-hand side, which is an HMO license. And that's where they're looking at the property, but they're also looking at the landlord as well to make sure that that landlord is a suitable landlord for HMO property. You have got to be careful though, because obviously there are certain councils, Leeds being one of them, Lancaster being one, because I'm from up north. I'm sure James can tell you a few other councils that are like this. The councils don't have to follow the HMO 5-bed rule for a licensed property. They can actually make it 4. So therefore, Lancaster and Leeds are 4-bedroom, even though the national requirement is 5+. Councils can be more restrictive in regard to their requirements and needs to kind of control the number of HMOs in a certain area.
Yeah, they will look to do it in certain areas, sometimes areas of predominantly student housing. I think Portsmouth and Bournemouth councils have done that. It's the same as selective licensing. Sometimes they'll bring it in to keep control of an area, or sometimes to improve it. So although there's a national framework, the local authority can set their guidelines specifically how they like as well.
Super. Thank you, James. So, next page. So next page, this is just to give you an idea, not just regarding the license that's required for an HMO, but obviously there are requirements within a requirement of an HMO. So again, this is only for the licensed HMO. So this only affects the properties where the council, local council, whether it be 4-bed or 5-bed, will require a license. There was minimum sizes of rooms put in place, typically for one person, 6.51, for two people sharing a room, 10.22. So again, that's the government requirement when a property needs an HMO license. However, as you can see on the right-hand side, this is from Norwich Council. Actually, some councils then adopt more restrictive requirements for the room size because they're trying to improve the living standard. Maybe some of the rooms in that area, like James mentioned before, they're trying to be restrictive with license kind of requirements to make sure that there isn't an abundance and an oversupply of HMO property that is not suitable, maybe too small, etc. And obviously Norwich Council have probably found that, so therefore they've introduced more specific requirements that require rooms to have different kind of elements to it. So again, don't just rely on the government guidance, because many councils do have more prescriptive rules. So therefore it's worth diving a little bit deeper, not just looking at the HMO rules that exist, but also whether the council have more prescriptive rules when it comes to HMO.
Do you want to add that, sometimes the council will make discretions on room sizes as well and grant a license. As long as we see evidence of that, that's fine. And also we can look at, say, a 6-bed house where one of the bedrooms is too small. It's got a license as 5 beds. We can look to ignore that room and value it on a 5-bed basis. We'll probably have a license on a 5-bed basis, but just don't discount it because it's got a license for 5, but it's actually 6. We could still look at it and do something.
Thank you, James. So now we're going to move on to a bit of planning and conversion. And this is very relevant in many areas, well, all areas, I should say, with regard to how your landlord's looking to either kind of change a single dwelling to an HMO, or whether they've got an existing property, they're trying to improve the existing property and add maybe further rooms to the existing property. This is very relevant to all circumstances. So there's 3 main kind of planning and conversion requirement restrictions, or not restrictions, guidances within the kind of planning rules, and that's C3, C4, and sui generis. And usually, a single dwelling house can be converted to an HMO house, up to I'd say 6 people sharing. Because there's not sui generis, because sui generis is 7 or more, so up to 6 individual tenants sharing a property. So I could take my house, which is a normal residential house. I could convert one of the reception rooms downstairs to a 5-bed HMO property quite easily. I would not need any planning. However, depends on whether there is any restrictions in the area. If there is what's called an Article 4 restriction in an area, that would mean I then can't move my property from C3 to C4. And the government, the local councils have usually done this. I've got an example on the next page of a council that's done this. And they're very kind of specific about the area, usually that they want to make sure that you can't change your normal single dwelling to an HMO property. And it's normally areas that are overrun with student properties or shared properties, and areas like Headingley and Leeds, Manchester, Portsmouth, as James mentioned, down south. Many different areas will have article restrictions. And again, it's very relevant for your landlord and for you as a broker to educate your landlords to make sure they're going that extra mile to make sure that there's no restrictions that makes them buying from auction potentially that property that they intend to change to an HMO, without knowing that obviously they can't change it to an HMO, because the Article 4 restriction is very, very tight. I've not seen many scenarios where a landlord has been able to circumnavigate from C3 to C4 when there is an Article 4 restriction in that area. Now, sui generis is another planning kind of parameter, and sui generis basically covers anything above 7. This is a little bit more difficult because you might have an example where a client owns a 6-bed HMO and it's been rented as a 6-bed HMO for many, many years. And actually they've got some loft space, they've maybe got a basement, and that landlord wouldn't usually need planning permission for something like that. However, sui generis means you do need planning permission because you're taking your property from a C4 to sui generis, because obviously you're going to tenant it with more than 6 tenants. So you have got to be very careful. You would need express lawful development to make sure that that consent is there, which is essentially planning. I think James was going to add a little bit on that point as well.
Yeah, where there is not necessarily wiggle room, if the property is in a C3 area and has been say a 5-6 bed HMO historically, and the area changes to C4, then they don't need to apply for a planning permission because they've got that historic use, which as long as you can prove, the local authority will confirm you don't need planning. We had an instance recently where we proved a solicitor wrong, where the council confirmed they didn't need it because it had the historic use. Usually council tax bills or something, or previous tenancies can prove that. But however, if it was like that, then the area changed to C4 and they put the property back to say single occupancy use, and the area was C4, and then changed it to a HMO again, then they'd have to apply for planning. But because it would have had the past before, because it had historic use, you lose that as soon as you convert it back. We do have instances where obviously the planning hasn't been obtained and they apply for the certificate of lawful use. It depends on the local authority. Some we've had come through quite quickly, some say 6 to 8 weeks. But it's just one of those things that needs confirming. It can just hold cases up when we get to legals, and solicitors come across it and we need to wait for planning. So it usually will come up at valuation where the valuer will ask for confirmation. But yeah, there are, like as I said, we can find a way that's comfortable with a lot of things, but there is you can't get past the planning if it needs it, unfortunately. And also we get issues where the property has a license but it doesn't have planning, and unfortunately the planning and the licensing department, the local authorities, don't talk to each other. So although we've got one or the other, we need to have both. So
correct. And to reiterate James's point, that there is lots of councils that are quite quick in allowing lawful development certificates, but usually areas that are highly populated by this type of property are the areas that aren't giving out lawful development certificates. Like Manchester, for example, pretty much won't give a lawful development certificate for a property moving from a 6-bed HMO to a larger HMO because there's just too many properties in that area. So this is just an example. Leeds, which is up north, if there's any southerners on the call today. Leeds basically was one of the first councils that actually added an Article 4 direction, and as say the restriction from being able to move your property as a residential to an HMO. They were one of the first councils that introduced this because they were overrun with a number of student and HMO properties in the area. Not just students, but professionals, obviously, because the area was attractive for kind of newly qualified or new graduates. The area is still very heavily populated with people that then stay in the area. And obviously what we've seen, and I think, sorry, I've left that. What we've seen in the last few years is that the standard of HMO has kind of improved that much that obviously that's why the graduates are staying, because the cost of moving to a house on your own is significant. So therefore sharing a property with fellow graduates or people that work in the town centre or near a hospital, the standard of accommodation now for an HMO is fantastic. Really is fantastic. There's also, obviously, Leeds were very prescriptive with the areas that they took, but obviously there are certain councils that do blanket licenses as well. So that's why you've got to be very careful. Your landlord's got to be kind of in touch with the council to make sure, for example, they are buying that property at auction and they're planning to change it to an HMO. Actually, the fact that the council is planning a blanket license may actually affect whether that client can then do what they want to do. So again, it's imperative that the landlord and yourself educate each other in regard to making sure that they're aware what plans are afoot with regard to local councils. And that can be as well changes to the HMO licensing. So for example, it might be 5 now. That local council may well reduce to 4-bed, requiring a license within a matter of months or a matter of weeks. This is just an example of where you can move a property from that C3 to C4, where there is no article restriction. Simply, the simple example is a property in Norwich, typically let for £1,000. Again, a standard property, 250, 280. I don't know Norwich that well. Obviously, these are kind of standard criteria, standard kind of templates. Essentially, it's a standard property, got a couple of reception rooms, a couple of bedrooms, 3 bedrooms. Basically, the conversion, which is quite simple, you make it a 4-bed HMO because actually you change one of the front reception rooms to a bedroom, and it automatically increases the rent exponentially. So typical rental for the property on the left-hand side, which is the normal residential, was 1,000, and obviously potentially in the right area that could then attract £1,800 in rent. And again, this is why landlords are looking at the benefits of HMO. There are more complications with HMO in regard to making sure that you understand the harmony you've got to have with regard to the property, because obviously you don't want one tenant then upset to the rest. So there is more kind of parameters a landlord has to take on board, rather than just looking at the yield is like double the price of the standard rental, but it's obviously probably double the kind of work needed to make sure that that property works well. So move on to some criteria. As I say, at Landbay, sorry, I keep on pressing the wrong button. At Landbay, we have some parameters that I think are quite generous. This picture I took from images online last night doesn't quite show an HMO, but it's lots of different rooms in a property, so hopefully you get the idea. Minimum value for our criteria for HMO is £120,000. We can actually look at certain areas being £75,000. Those areas are typically up north, and there is a link on our website that shows which postcodes would allow a property value at £75,000 for an HMO. We've got to 12 beds, but the good thing is we separate our criteria between small HMOs, which is up to 6 bed, and large HMOs. Typically, I say up to 12, but we can look at the right scenario being a little bit larger than 12 as well. 75% LTV. There are some lenders that are pushing it to 80. We are looking at that, so do watch out for what criteria we might introduce in the next few months. But at 75% at the moment. Max loan size, which is very generous. Lots of different lenders restrict loan size on large HMOs around £750 to £1 million when it's at 75% LTV, but we'll actually lend 75% up to 1.5 million, which is good for the southern type properties. And in a later slide, I'll show you maybe how it's relevant with regard to the size and the value of the properties. That £2 million is quite easily obtainable in certain areas that are high value areas. We only need 12 months experience as well, which against our peers is quite generous. So 12 months experience doesn't have to be necessarily an HMO. It can be normal kind of rental properties as well. So for example, if the clients have had one for 11 months and they apply, they're going to have the 12 months experience before they go to offer or completion at least, then we can apply that. However, we did introduce a couple of months back the ability for first-time landlords who own a residential, look into their first buy-to-let, and obviously they see the attraction of looking at yields. We can do first-time landlords, but we would restrict the LTV to 70%, and we would only offer it for small HMOs, because we do believe as a lender, you do need that extra bit of education and kind of knowledge when it comes to HMO management and HMO property than a normal single dwelling or family house. And again, we do investment valuations. We've got a separate slide on that in a couple of slides that I think is relevant to point out the difference between types of valuations when you are looking at HMO. Anything to add, James, before I move on to multi-unit?
No, we did have a question which I have answered from Stuart Bailey. Just would we need a property to be a 4-bed HMO on application, or where a room needs dividing, could you consider minimal works to take place once the completion takes place? And I've just said basically we'd need it as a 4-bed HMO, not necessarily on application, but at valuation and completion, because that's what we're lending on. We can't lend on what it will be in case that doesn't happen. And we've had a few instances, like on the examples given, where if it's just a case of a reception room that's been turned into a bedroom with no works needed, then we can ask for it to be valued as a 4 or 5 bed accordingly. And as always, as long as there's demand and etc. for the property to be a HMO, then it will be valued like that. But yeah, if there's any works needed to be undertaken to turn it into HMO, then we need those done beforehand.
Thank you, James. I would have said exactly the same. So, multi-unit criteria. Multi-unit freehold block, that's what MUFB stands for. Some lenders call it a multi-unit block. We call it a multi-unit freehold block. I'll tell you a little bit more at the end in regard to why we call it a freehold block. And I think it's common with many lenders with regard to the freehold itself. So again, minimum value is £120,000. Unfortunately, we don't have exceptions with regard to certain areas being below 120. There's a relevance to that, which I'll point out very shortly. And we follow the same rules as HMO. So we go up to 12 units on one block. We actually have a product range that's what we class as small multi-unit freehold blocks up to 6 units. Large MUFBs are 7 unit and above up to 12. Apologies, I put beds there. It's 6 units. So actually what you could find is that small unit MUFB is 6 flats, but actually there's 3 rooms in every single one of the flats. We would still class that as a 6 unit MUFB. We go up to 75% LTV. And again, we mirror the HMO where we can go up to 1.5 mil in lending, which is really advantageous for the right area, obviously, not in my area. We also require 12 months experience again. And again, it follows the same 11 months experience from a buy-to-let. Looking for your second buy-to-let, we can obviously offer that experience because that client will have that experience. And the other good thing is, well, we offer first-time landlord on multi-unit freehold blocks as well. And I think we are one of only a very, very small handful and potentially no lenders on your panel at Open Work that would also offer a first-time landlord scenario to multi-unit freehold blocks. I take that back. There is one other lender on your panel that does allow that. We obviously offer investment valuations for this type of property as well. Again, investment valuations when it comes to multi-units, I'll point it out when we move on to that slide, actually. Investment valuations can be relevant when it comes to multi-units as well. So specific criteria for the self-contained nature to make sure we know it's a multi-unit. Most lenders do require the units to be self-contained. And what I mean by self-contained is that you're not sharing a bathroom across the room, across the hallway, I should say. You're not sharing the kitchen across the hallway. They are specific units. And the good thing is we don't ask for a minimum value per unit. Many lenders do. We do have a minimum size per unit, which is 25 square meters, and have actually missed one piece of criteria is that we need the utilities to be split as well per unit. So that's what the self-contained becomes, the utilities being split and obviously not having a bathroom or a kitchen across the wall, or across the hall, I should say. So the picture on the left-hand side is a good little tip of what we do accept, because we don't have to just accept, it doesn't have to be flats. The common inquiry is where it's a terraced house that's too large, that's been converted into 3 or 4 flats. That's your typical type of makeup of an MUFB. But obviously what also can class as a multi-unit freehold block is 3 different properties. For example, a developer that's bought a piece of land and built 3 muse houses or built 3 houses as such on the left-hand side, we can actually still class that as an MUFB. Typically, we want to see it a maximum of 5 or 6. But again, the right scenario, we refer it to James and we take a view on what we can and what we can't do. So it's a nice little kind of tip that we offer that many other lenders don't offer. And the reason we call it...
Yeah, I was just going to say, we've seen new build developments where they want to keep the development. So usually not large developments we'll look at, but small like infill developments we've looked at. And sometimes it could be a mixture of houses and flats. So it could be a block of 3 flats and 2 houses on one title. We'd look at that. And also to add about the utilities being split, we can sometimes consider if there's a communal heating system. So say that the boiler's in a communal area and has a communal heating system, then we'll look at that as long as the electricity is split. We don't get so, as long as that heating is communal and the boiler is not in one of the units, then we consider that. And same with water, we don't necessarily need the water to be split either. So that's a couple of extra little details that might help with an application.
Excellent. And I say the reason why we call it a multi-unit freehold block is because there's a differentiation between, you can also get multi-unit leasehold blocks as well. Unfortunately, we can't lend on multi-unit leasehold blocks. I think there is one other lender on your panel that does, but make sure you work out whether there is a lease that may be above. A typical example is where you've got 3 flats above a commercial property, and the landlord split the commercial off, kept that on a freehold, but what they've done, they've created a lease across 3 flats above. That's your typical example of a multi-unit leasehold block. And there are a few lenders in the market, unfortunately, that cannot do that, including ourselves. Just watch out for that. So I wanted to give you a quick example of what is the difference between an investment valuation and a residential valuation. And this is more cautionary as well, because lots of landlords in the market do look for investment valuations, and unfortunately, it's not always the right kind of valuation, and it doesn't give you the benefits that actually were maybe sold to them when they first bought the property. So the example I've got here on the right-hand side, apologies, my old slide was left and right. This one's all on one side. So on the right-hand side, the property is a standard residential property. It's an Article 4 area in Leeds. It's a 4-bed, 2-bed reception, and it's valued on a bricks and mortar at £200,000. Now, the property on the right-hand side cannot be converted because of the Article 4. Remember, that restricts that property on the right-hand side being converted into an HMO property. So in this example here, the property will only value on our bricks and mortar. However, because we look at investment valuations, the property on the left-hand side potentially has a different value to bricks and mortar. It's again, because it's Article 4, because it's got that established use, it's a 4-bed, 1 reception room converted to a 5th bedroom, so it's a 5-bed HMO. Potentially, because an investment valuation looks at yield, there is that potential to get a higher valuation, or what we consider the true valuation of an HMO. But obviously, what you've got to see, the value has got to be able to see comparables that support there are sales for HMO that are different to the residential properties in the market. So that's a typical example of where an investment valuation can actually provide the most accurate valuation rather than the kind of single bricks and mortar valuation that lots of lenders do offer. However, to caveat that, there are examples where people, as I say, try and take advantage of investment valuations, which simply don't work. The example I've got here is a property in Liverpool, where the right-hand side is a residential house, standard valuation. There is that no Article 4. Article 4 isn't the be-all and end-all when it comes to whether an investment valuation will work or not, but there is no Article 4 direction in this area. It's a 3-bed property, 2 reception rooms. Property value is £75,000. But what might happen, a landlord that has been sold a dream with regard to a high yield has been told, well, you need to seek a lender that offer investment valuations. We'd offer an investment valuation on this property, but unfortunately, we would give you exactly the same valuation as a standard bricks and mortar. Because it's a 3-bed reception, just because it's had one of the reception rooms converted to a bedroom to make it a 4-bed HMO, the property is still £75,000. Because the property on the right-hand side, because it's a residential house, because there's no Article 4 restriction, can simply change to become the property on the left. So there is no premium attached whatsoever to the fact that they've converted one of the reception rooms to a further bedroom. And that's the thing you've got to be very careful with regard to looking at investment valuations over standard valuations. And I mentioned the point earlier on, and sorry, I've left MUFB criteria at the bottom of this page. It's investment, it's valuation examples. One of the things that works with investment valuations when you're looking at multi-unit freehold blocks is because we're one of the few lenders in the market that allow within a multi-unit block 25 square meters per unit. Theoretically, there is no standalone value to a flat that's only 25 square meters. So therefore, looking at a lender that offers a standard valuation on a multi-unit freehold block, you may well find that one, there's a minimum value required, or they've got to be 30 square meters. At Landbay, because we've got that requirement of 25 square meters on an investment valuation, we can value the property without any issues. The valuation doesn't fail, which might be the case if you use a lender that doesn't offer investment valuations for multi-unit freehold blocks.
Cool, sure. Right, if I had some bits on this.
Yeah, please.
Cool.
You see more valuations than me, James?
Yeah, so I was going to add, like Ian's example here, we do get a fair few of these come up where the value will say there's no additional value attached to it being a HMO because it's not in a Article 4 area. So there's no license requirement. There's no barrier to entry. So you don't get the premium because you haven't gone through the rigmarole of applying for the license, getting the license. Someone can buy an identical property like these two and make it a 4-bed with no additional work. So there's no uplift there. You get the additional rental, but essentially there's no like comparables or market saying that now it's a 4-bed, it's worth any more. So it's just to be aware of that, really, because although the rental is higher, you can still buy the identical property for the lower value. So from a lender's point of view, worst case scenario, if you've got to sell the property, it's only going to sell for that value. So that's what we lend off. We always lend off the market value. And with multi-unit, we do get 3 different types of valuations. So standard property, standard val, small HMOs, we get a hybrid valuation, which will give the investment figure for a HMO, and then it will give a market value as a standard property, or 180-day figure. So if the property was to be sold in 180 days, what would you achieve? And then for all multi-unit freehold blocks and large HMOs, we get the standard RICS Red Book valuation, which is a far more in-depth valuation, 40-odd pages long, which goes into a lot more detail and will give you the investment valuation, which is a market valuation for how it is, also the 180-day figures, and also the market rent. And it gives a lot more in-depth analysis on comparables and the SWOT analysis of the area, plus market commentary in the area. One word of note on MUFBs is we do get circumstances where people will assume, you've got 4 decent units worth 100 grand each, therefore the property must be worth 400,000, whereas that is essentially the breakup value. We won't lend off the breakup value. In most circumstances, the valuers will knock a little bit off, depending on the area and the type of development, because there will be costs involved in creating that breakup value. So if it's a freehold house of 4-unit flats, there's a cost involved of creating the leases and selling them 4 different times, and whereas the development of 5 houses, there's the cost involved of creating 5 separate titles and selling them. So as we're lending in on it as a freehold block, that's what it's valued as, and we'll make our lending based on that.
Thank you, James. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Usually I'd give you a few other bits of criteria, but I knew this one was going to be a little bit longer, so I've left some time for questions. Do remember that the EPC products that we do have some products that cover HMOs as well. However, one word of caution, lots of different HMOs don't actually need EPCs. So if the property is rented to students, I do believe you don't need an EPC. So just bear that in mind. And again, we've done a few things on the EPCs or mentioned them in the past. If you look out for our product range at the moment, we've got some cracking products which are significantly reduced from our standard range if your EPC is A to C, and that actually includes new builds as well, which I think bucks the trend in the market with regard to offering it on new builds. We've got some exciting things happening, hopefully next week as well. So I can't reveal everything yet, but you will find out next week. It's just our kind of thank you for the support that we've got already from Openwork as a network, and obviously kind of further hopefully supports using Lambe in the future. So thanks for listening. I think we have a couple of questions that we had before the presentation. Do you want to cover some of them, James?
Yeah, there was one from Christopher Bell. Do HMOs need to be limited company mortgages, and if not, why not? We don't specify. You can be individual or limited company for HMOs. It doesn't make any difference for us. I've dealt with large portfolio landlords who've got them in their personal names because they've historically been in personal names, and some of their new stuff's going into limited company. As long as they meet the criteria and they've got the relevant experience for the standard products, then we don't differentiate. Also, while I'm thinking, actual licenses, who the name of the license is in, 9 times out of 10, we need the license in the applicant's name. But say it's a large portfolio landlord, and he has a company specifically deals with his licensing requirements, or a management company, and they run the license, as long as we can trace that back, that's cool as well. We're fine with that, because I know some lenders get funny if the license isn't in the applicant's name. And obviously for purchase applications, you can't get the license because you're purchasing it, so we don't specify that. And if it's recently been converted, a remade, it's recently been converted to a HMO, and it will now need a license. If it's been converted recently, as long as we can see that the license has been applied for, that's fine, because a lot of local authorities do have large backlogs of licensing. So as long as we can see the license has been granted, and ideally an intention to grant it, then we're fine with that.
I was going to make that very point. Thank you, James, because that's a really relevant point. The fact that councils are so far behind, the majority of times that you don't have the HMO license to hand when you do the conversion. Obviously, the valuer will comment, for example, if the client has done the HMO conversion, obviously they've applied for the license. The valuer may comment as well the kind of likelihood of them obtaining that license as well. So the two in the hand, they go hand in hand essentially with regard to what the valuer says, and obviously the proof they have applied for the license. We also had a question from Paul. What is land-based appetite for purpose-built student accommodation? And this is obviously an HMO apartment that's 6-bed en suite. You've got a communal kitchen in a purpose-built block. Unfortunately, when it's a purpose-built block, it does affect sellability. Unfortunately, we would struggle to lend. I mean, we have lent on properties that have been built specifically for students. However, they're not in blocks, like Paul might be referring to. It's always worth referring that type of scenario to us, but typically there'll be restrictions on the lease that means that this property can only ever be rented to students, which from a lender's perspective means it's a very restrictive market, so it causes all lenders trouble. But again, landlords and developers are getting very akin to this, because they know if they build the right type of property with regard to each property having an ensuite and nice kitchens, nice living areas, etc., it can look like a purpose-built block. But if it's a standalone, or there's a small number of units in that block that's been developed specifically for multiple sharers, then we can look at those case-by-case basis. But when you've got a large block that's, 4 or 5 floors, and they're all kind of apartments with 6 bedrooms, we do struggle with those types of properties, unfortunately. I don't think we've got any more questions, have we? No. I'm going to stop sharing, I think. I know we've still got some people in the room. Are there any more questions? No. There's a few people leaving as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. We've got another session next week. I think it's either the penultimate or even the last session. Hopefully you found them interesting so far, and thank you for listening. I say any questions, you can feed them back via the channel you had originally, and we will then answer them next week as well. Thanks for listening. See you all soon. Thanks, James.
Yes.